There are fast cars, and then there are muscle cars that tried to kill their drivers. Machines so powerful, so primitive, and so utterly unhinged that getting behind the wheel was a test of courage more than a commute. These weren't built with safety in mind. They were built with one goal: domination. Domination of the drag strip, domination of the street, domination of anyone foolish enough to challenge them. From the raw brutality of the 60s, to the emissions-strangled 70s, to the surprising violence of the 80s comeback, American manufacturers built cars that separated the skilled from the survivors. Today, we're counting down 12 most dangerous muscle cars ever made. The machines that proved horsepower and handling don't always arrive together, and that sometimes the most legendary cars are the ones most likely to put you in a hospital. Number 12, the 1987 Buick GNX. The 80s weren't supposed to produce dangerous muscle cars. Emissions regulations, insurance costs, and fuel economy standards had neutered most performance machines by the mid-decade. But Buick had other ideas. The GNX was their final middle finger to anyone who thought turbochargers couldn't replace cubic inches. Under that sinister black hood sat a turbocharged 3.8-liter V6 that officially made 276 horsepower and 360 pound-feet of torque. But those numbers were lies, designed to keep insurance companies happy. Real output was closer to 300 horses at the crank, and the torque was even more underrated. The GNX could blast from 0 to 60 in under 5 seconds and run the quarter mile in the mid-13s. In 1987, those were supercar numbers. What made it deadly was the power delivery. Turbo lag was real in the 80s, and when that boost hit, it hit like a freight train. The rear tires would light up even with all the electronic aids doing their best to keep things civil. And because this was based on a mid-size sedan platform, the chassis wasn't exactly designed for this kind of punishment. The steering was numb, the brakes were adequate at best, and the suspension was tuned for straight-line speed more than cornering finesse. Get on the power too early, coming out of a turn, and the rear end would step out, sending you into an unplanned drift. The GNX demanded respect. It was fast, furious, and unforgiving. Only 547 were built, which made them instant collectibles. But it also meant that every time one left the showroom, there was a decent chance it would end up wrapped around something solid. The all-black paint scheme added to the intimidation factor. This car looked like it belonged in a villain's garage, and it drove like it too. Number 11, the 1970 Plymouth Hemi Cuda convertible. Only 7 of these were built, which makes them unicorns today worth millions of dollars. But back in 1970, they were just insanely powerful convertibles that could kill you if you didn't respect what you were sitting in. Under the hood sat the legendary 426 cubic inch Hemi 8, making 425 horsepower and 490 pound-feet of torque. But those numbers were fiction designed to keep insurance companies and sanctioning bodies happy. Real output was closer to 500 horses, and the Hemi's torque curve was as flat and brutal as a baseball bat to the head. The Hemi Cuda convertible could run the quarter mile in the low 13s and hit 60 in under 6 seconds. Those were numbers that would still be impressive today, and this was 1970, with bias-ply tires and no electronic aids whatsoever. But add in the fact that this was a convertible, which meant the chassis had less structural rigidity than the hardtop, and you had a recipe for disaster. The body would flex under hard acceleration or during aggressive cornering, which made the handling even more unpredictable than it already was. The steering was vague, the suspension was overwhelmed, and the brakes were laughably inadequate for the speeds this car could reach. The Hemi engine required constant attention. Those dual 4-barrel carburetors needed regular tuning, and when they weren't perfectly synchronized, the engine would stumble and surge. That unpredictability was dangerous when you were already trying to manage 500 horsepower through tires that had maybe half the grip of modern rubber. The convertible top also meant visibility was compromised when it was up, and wind buffeting was severe when it was down at high speeds. The short wheelbase, just 108 inches, made weight transfer dramatic and violent during acceleration and braking. What made the Hemi Cuda convertible truly dangerous was the combination of insane power, compromised structure, primitive chassis dynamics, and absolute rarity. These cars were so expensive and so rare that most owners didn't drive them hard enough to learn their limits. And when they did, the results were often catastrophic. Number 10, the 1969 Chevrolet Camaro ZL1. This wasn't just a high-performance option, it was a race car with license plates. Built to dominate drag strips and make Chevrolet the undisputed king of straight-line performance. The ZL1 designation referred to the all-aluminum 427 cubic inch V8 that was officially rated at 430 horsepower. That number was so laughably conservative that even Chevrolet dealerships knew it was fiction. Real output was over 560 horses, with some estimates putting it closer to 600. The all-aluminum construction meant the engine weighed about 100 pounds less than the cast-iron version, which improved weight distribution while maintaining apocalyptic power levels. The ZL1 Camaro could run the quarter mile in the low 11s at over 120 miles per hour. It could hit 60 miles per hour in under 5 seconds. Those were professional drag racing numbers in a car that was technically street legal, but everything about the ZL1 was extreme. The solid lifter camshaft had so much duration and overlap that the engine barely made power below 3,000 RPM. The idle was violent and lumpy, shaking the entire car and rattling anything that wasn't bolted down. The compression ratio was over 12.5 to 1, which meant it required racing fuel. Run regular unleaded and the engine would destroy itself through pre-ignition and detonation within minutes. The carburetion was tuned for top-end power rather than drivability, making the car difficult to drive in traffic or at low speeds. But above 4,000 RPM, the ZL1 engine transformed into a monster that made power in amounts that should have been impossible for a naturally aspirated engine of that era. The chassis was completely overwhelmed. The first-generation Camaro's unibody structure wasn't designed for this kind of power. The suspension was adequate for the base inline-six engine, but hopeless, with 600 horsepower. The rear end would break loose at the slightest provocation, and catching a slide required lightning-fast reflexes and expert car control. The brakes were front discs and rear drums, which was completely inadequate for a car this fast. Stopping from high speeds required massive distances, and fades set in after just a few hard applications. What made the ZL1 truly legendary and truly dangerous was its rarity and cost. Only 69 were built, and they cost over $7,000 when a standard Camaro could be had for $2,500. That meant only serious racers and wealthy enthusiasts bought them. But even experienced drivers found the ZL1 to be a handful that demanded total concentration and respect. Number 9, the 1974 Pontiac Firebird Trans Am Superduty 455. By 1974, the muscle car era was supposed to be dead and buried. But Pontiac had one last ace up their sleeve, the Superduty 455. This was a 7.5-liter monster that officially made 290 horsepower by the new SAE net ratings. But those were numbers measured with all accessories attached and full exhaust restrictions in place. The reality was far more violent. The Superduty 455 was an honest-to-goodness race engine that Pontiac somehow convinced regulators to let them sell to the public. It featured forged pistons, a high-lift cam, special heads with larger valves and improved porting, and an attitude that said emissions regulations could go to hell. Only around 1,000 were built, which made them instant legends. The Trans Am could hit 60 in under 6 seconds and run the quarter mile in the mid-13s, which was astonishing for a car built in the middle of the malaise era. But it was also astonishing how willing this car was to swap ends on you. The Superduty's massive torque curve meant power was available everywhere, and that meant the rear tires were constantly on the edge of breaking loose. The chassis was the same as the standard Trans Am, which meant it wasn't really designed to handle this much thrust. The steering was slow, the suspension was soft, and the brakes were barely adequate. Get on the power mid-corner and the rear end would step out so violently that only experienced drivers could catch it before the car was facing the wrong direction. The engine required premium fuel at a time when the gas crisis made premium hard to find and expensive to buy. Run regular unleaded, and the engine would ping and knock, like it was trying to tear itself apart. The solid lifter cam meant valve adjustments every few thousand miles, and the Rochester Quadra Jet carburetor was finicky at best. This wasn't a car you could just jump in and drive. It required maintenance, attention, and a constant awareness that you were piloting something that demanded respect. The Superduty Trans Am was Pontiac's middle finger to everyone who said performance was dead, and it was glorious and terrifying in equal measure. Number 8, the 1970 Chevrolet Chevelle SS454 LS6. This was the pinnacle, the absolute peak of Chevrolet muscle before everything came crashing down. The Chevelle SS with the LS6454 cubic inch V8 was rated at 450 horsepower and 500 pound-feet of torque, but everyone knew those numbers were lies. Conservative estimates put the real output closer to 500 horses, and dyno tests proved it. This engine was so powerful that Chevy only offered it for 1 year because it was too much, too brutal, too dangerous. The LS6 could propel the Chevelle from 0 to 60 in around 5.5 seconds, and through the quarter mile in the high 13s. Those were numbers that would still be respectable today, and this was 1970 with primitive tires and no electronic aids. But all that power came without any of the safety nets we take for granted now. No traction control, no stability management, no anti-lock brakes. Just you, a steering wheel, and 500 horsepower trying to kill you. The Chevelle's chassis was competent for the era, but it wasn't designed for this kind of abuse. The rear suspension would squat under hard acceleration, loading the rear tires until they finally gave up and turned into smoke machines. The front end would lift, making steering light and vague, right when you needed precision most. And the brakes, even with the optional front discs, were marginal at best for a car that could reach speeds where mistakes became catastrophic. The LS6 engine featured forged internals that could handle sustained high RPM operation. The cylinder heads flowed massive amounts of air, and the camshaft profile was aggressive enough to make the engine idle rough and create significant overlap. The solid lifter valve train required regular adjustment, and the high compression ratio demanded premium fuel. What made the LS6 Chevelle truly dangerous was its accessibility. It looked like any other Chevelle on the road, which meant people underestimated it constantly. And that led to a lot of street races that ended badly, a lot of show-offs that ended in ditches, and a lot of legends about the car that was too powerful to survive. The LS6 represented the last gasp of unlimited horsepower, before emissions regulations and insurance costs killed the party. Number 7, the 1967 Chevrolet Corvette L88. The L88. Corvette was barely street legal. Chevrolet built it for racing, but they had to sell a certain number to qualify for competition homologation. So they created what was essentially a race car with headlights and sold it to anyone with enough money and courage. The 7.0-liter V8 was officially rated at 430 horsepower, but that was a lie so blatant it was almost insulting. Real output was over 560 horses, with some estimates putting it closer to 600. The L88 could run the quarter mile in the low 12s and hit 60 in under 4 seconds. Those were numbers that would still be impressive today, achieved in 1967 with technology that seems primitive now. But everything about the L88 was compromised for racing. The compression ratio was 12.5 to 1, which meant it required racing fuel with octane ratings well above what was available at gas stations. Run pump gas, and the engine would destroy itself through detonation within minutes. The solid lifter camshaft had so much duration and overlap that the engine barely ran below 3,000 RPM. The idle was so rough that parts would vibrate loose if you didn't safety wire everything. And there was no heater, no radio, no sound deadening, nothing that didn't make the car faster. Chevrolet literally removed comfort and convenience features to discourage street use. The chassis couldn't handle the power. The C2 Corvette's independent rear suspension was sophisticated for the era, but it used a single transverse leaf spring that allowed the rear wheels to tuck under the body during hard cornering. That sudden camber change would cause the rear end to break loose without warning, sending the car into a spin. The front suspension wasn't much better, with geometry that caused severe understeer at the limit. The brakes were four-wheel discs, which was excellent for the era, but they were designed for the base engine, not the monster L88. They would overheat quickly during hard use, and fade was a constant problem. The steering was quick but not communicative, which meant you were always guessing at the limits of traction. Chevrolet only sold 20 L88 Corvettes in 1967, and most went directly to race teams who knew what they were getting into. But a few ended up with wealthy enthusiasts who who discovered they'd bought a car that was completely undrivable on the street and terrifying at the track. Number 6. The 1969 Dodge Charger Daytona. The Daytona was built for NASCAR superspeedways, with a massive nose cone and towering rear wing that made it look like it had escaped from a science fiction movie. But those aerodynamic aids weren't just for show, they actually worked. The nose cone reduced frontal area and improved airflow, while the rear wing provided downforce at high speeds. Under the hood, serious buyers ordered the 426 cubic inch Hemi 58, making over 500 horsepower in race trim. The Daytona could hit speeds exceeding 200 miles per hour on NASCAR ovals, which was the whole point, but on the street it was a different story. The aerodynamic modifications that made the car stable at racing speeds made it strange at legal speeds. The long nose meant you couldn't see where the front of the car was, making parking and low-speed maneuvering difficult. The rear wing created drag at highway speeds without providing meaningful downforce. And the Hemi engine was the same temperamental beast it was in every other application. Docile below 3,000 RPM, violent above it. The unibody construction would flex under hard use, doors would become difficult to open after hard acceleration, and panel gaps would change as the structure twisted. The rear suspension used leaf springs and a solid axle, which meant wheel hop was common during hard launches. What made the Daytona particularly dangerous was that it looked so exotic that drivers thought it must handle like a race car. But the reality was that this was a NASCAR oval track car pressed into street service. It was optimized for high-speed stability on banked turns, not for navigating city streets or canyon roads. The steering was slow and vague, the brakes were marginal, and the massive power came on suddenly and violently. Only about 500 were built for homologation purposes, making them rare and valuable. But in everyday use, they were difficult, temperamental, and genuinely dangerous in inexperienced hands. Number 5. The 1970 Buick GSX Stage 1. Buick wasn't known for building muscle cars, which made the GSX all the more shocking. This was Buick's declaration that they could build something just as brutal as anything from Pontiac, Oldsmobile, or Chevrolet. The GSX came in wild colors, Apollo white and Saturn yellow, with bold stripes and graphics that announced this wasn't your grandfather's Buick. Under the hood sat the 455 cubic inch Stage 1 V8, which officially made 360 horsepower and 510 pound-feet of torque. That torque number was staggering. It was more than the Hemi, more than the LS6, more than anything else on American roads in 1970. And you felt every single pound-foot of it. The GSX could rip through the quarter mile in the high 13s and hit 60 in under 6 seconds. But it weighed over 3,700 pounds, which meant it had momentum that simply refused to be denied. The steering was slow and vague, typical of GM's body platform, and the brakes were marginal at best. The suspension was tuned more for comfort than performance, which meant body roll was dramatic in corners. But the real danger was that torque. Plant your foot and the GSX would squat on its rear suspension, load up those rear tires, and then launch forward with a violence that could catch even experienced drivers off guard. The rear end would step out under hard acceleration, and correcting it required quick hands and quicker thinking. The Stage 1 engine was built for low-end torque, which meant it pulled like a freight train from idle but ran out of breath at higher RPM. That power delivery encouraged drivers to keep the revs low and lean on that torque, which made it easy to overwhelm the rear tires at almost any speed. The automatic transmission was the only option, which meant you couldn't use a manual gearbox to help control power delivery. The GSX looked understated compared to cars like the Roadrunner or Challenger, but that understated appearance meant people underestimated it, which led to a lot of surprised faces and even more surprised insurance adjusters. Only about 678 GSX models were built in 1970, making them rare and valuable today. But back then, they were just Buicks that could kill you. Number 4. The 1968 Ford Mustang Cobra Jet 428. Ford's answer to the big block pony car wars redefined what was possible in a compact chassis. The Cobra Jet 428 was officially rated at 335 horsepower, which was the same rating Ford gave to multiple engines, regardless of actual output. The Cobra Jet's real power was closer to 410 horses, with torque exceeding 440 pound-feet. Ford achieved this by improving everything that mattered for performance: larger valves, better exhaust manifolds, and a revised camshaft. The Mustang Cobra Jet could run the quarter-mile in the mid-13s and hit 60 in just over 6 seconds. But stuffing a big block into the Mustang's compact engine bay created serious compromises. The engine sat far forward in the chassis, which made the weight distribution heavily nose-biased. Over 60% of the car's weight was on the front axle, which caused severe understeer. Turn into a corner and the front end would plow straight ahead, pushing wide no matter how much you cranked the steering wheel. The front suspension was overwhelmed by the weight. The spring rates were too soft, the shock absorbers were undersized, and the geometry wasn't optimized for the loads. The result was excessive nosedive under braking and significant body roll during cornering. The rear suspension used leaf springs and a solid axle, and the spring rates were chosen for ride comfort rather than performance. That meant the rear end would squat dramatically during hard acceleration, which helped plant the rear tires, but also made the front end light and vague, right when you needed steering precision. The brakes were front discs and rear drums, typical for the era, but the front heavy weight distribution meant the front brakes did most of the work, and they would fade quickly during aggressive driving. Once fade set in, stopping distances would nearly double, and the rear drums would lock up easily, sending the car into a spin. The Cobra Jet Mustang was a car that felt fast and looked aggressive, which encouraged spirited driving, but the chassis wasn't designed to handle big block power and weight, and it would bite drivers who pushed beyond its limits. The combination of massive power, nose-heavy weight distribution, and primitive suspension made it a car that demanded respect and skill. Number 3, the 1969 Dodge Charger, RT Hemi. Dodge's fastback muscle car was beautiful, powerful, and absolutely lethal in the wrong hands. The Charger RT, with the 426 cubic inch Hemi V8, represented the pinnacle of Mopar muscle. The Hemi made 425 horsepower and 490 pound-feet of torque officially, but real output was closer to 500 horses. The Charger Hemi could blast through the quarter mile in the low 13s and hit 60 in under 5.5 seconds. Those were supercar numbers in 1969, achieved with an engine that was essentially a race motor with street manners. But the Charger was a big car, over 208 inches long and weighing nearly 3,800 pounds. That size meant it had serious momentum once it got moving, and changing direction required planning and commitment. The long hood meant forward visibility was compromised. You couldn't see the front corners of the car, which made parking difficult and low-speed maneuvering hazardous. The unibody construction would flex under hard use, doors would become difficult to open after hard acceleration, and panel gaps would change as the structure twisted. The rear suspension used leaf springs and a solid axle, which meant wheel hop was common during hard launches. The Hemi's power delivery made this worse. The engine was docile below 3,000 RPM, then violent above it. There was no gentle transition, just an on-off switch. Below 3,000, you had a heavy, lazy engine that barely made power. Above 3,000, you had 500 horsepower trying to tear the rear axle out of the car. That sudden power delivery meant the rear tires would break loose violently when the engine came on the cam. And if you weren't ready for it, you'd be sideways before you could react. The steering was recirculating ball type, with lots of play and little feedback. You never really knew what the front tires were doing, which made precise driving impossible. And the brakes, while better than many competitors with standard front discs and rear drums, still weren't up to the task of repeatedly stopping this nearly 2-ton car from triple-digit speeds. The Charger Hemi was a car that made you feel invincible. The styling was aggressive, the sound was menacing, and the acceleration was intoxicating. But it demanded respect and skill, and it punished drivers who had more enthusiasm than ability. Number 2, the 1969 Pontiac GTO Judge Ram Air 4. Pontiac's wildest GTO combined outrageous styling with genuine performance credentials. The Judge package added bold graphics, a rear wing, and the Ram Air 4 engine option, a 400 cubic inch V8 that made 370 horsepower officially but over 400 in reality. The Ram Air 4 was built for top-end power with round port cylinder heads that flowed massive amounts of air and a camshaft with aggressive timing. The result was an engine that made most of its power between 4,000 and 6,000 RPM. Below that range, it was sluggish and lazy. Above it, It was a monster. The GTO Judge could run the quarter mile in the mid-13s and hit 60 in around 6 seconds, but the power delivery made it tricky to drive. You had to keep the engine in its narrow power band, which required precise shifting and careful throttle modulation. Drop below 4,000 RPM, and you'd fall out of the power band, losing momentum. Over-rev past 6,000, and you'd risk damage to the valve train. The chassis was typical GMA body, competent but not exceptional. The suspension used coil springs at all 4 corners, which was more sophisticated than leaf springs, but still allowed significant body roll. The steering was recirculating ball with power assist, which made it light but vague, and the brakes were front discs and rear drums, which was adequate for normal driving but marginal during sustained hard use. What made the Judge particularly dangerous was its image. This was a car that screamed performance, with its loud graphics and aggressive stance. It attracted young buyers who wanted to look fast and sometimes lacked the skills to actually drive fast. The combination of narrow power band, moderate grip, and inexperienced drivers led to a lot of crashed GTOs. The Judge represented everything that was wild about late 60s muscle cars. Loud, fast, and completely uncompromising in its pursuit of straight-line performance at the expense of everything else. Number 1, the 1970 Dodge Challenger, RT Hemi. At the top of our list sits the ultimate expression of Mopar muscle, the 1970 Dodge Challenger RT with the legendary Hemi engine. This was Dodge's answer to the Mustang and Camaro, but it was bigger, heavier, and more powerful than anything else in the pony car segment. The 426 cubic inch Hemi V8 made 425 horsepower and 490 pound-feet of torque, officially, but real output was closer to 500 horses. The Challenger Hemi could blast through the quarter mile in the low 13s and hit 60 in under 6 seconds. Those were numbers that put it in supercar territory, achieved in a car that looked like a street brawler ready for a fight. But the Challenger was massive for a pony car, over 110 inches in wheelbase and weighing nearly 3,600 pounds. That size meant it had serious momentum once it got moving, and changing direction required planning and commitment. The long hood, nearly 6 feet from bumper to windshield, meant forward visibility was compromised. You couldn't see the front corners of the car, which made parking difficult and low-speed maneuvering a challenge. The Hemi engine's power delivery was all or nothing. Below 3,000 RPM, the engine was docile and lazy, barely making enough power to move the heavy car with any enthusiasm. But above 3,000 RPM, when the engine came on the cam, it transformed into a 500 horsepower monster that would overwhelm the rear tires without warning. There was no gentle transition, no progressive power buildup. Just an on-off switch that separated skilled drivers from those about to have a very bad day. The rear suspension used leaf springs and a solid axle, which meant wheel hop was a constant problem during hard launches. Get on the power too aggressively, and the rear axle would wind up the leaf springs, storing energy. When the tires finally broke loose, that stored energy would release violently, causing the rear end to hop and skip like it was trying to shake itself loose from the chassis. The steering was recirculating ball type, with significant play and minimal feedback. You never really knew what the front tires were doing until it was too late. The brakes were front discs and rear drums, which was better than many competitors, but they still struggled with fade during repeated hard stops. The weight distribution was heavily front-biased, with the massive Hemi sitting far forward in the chassis. That made the car plow in corners, pushing straight ahead no matter how much you turned the steering wheel. But get on the power mid-corner, and suddenly all that weight would transfer rearward. The rear tires would break loose, and you'd be in a drift whether you wanted one or not. What made the Hemi Challenger truly dangerous was that it attracted buyers who wanted the biggest, baddest muscle car on the block. Many of these buyers were young, inexperienced, and unprepared for the reality of managing 500 horsepower through a live rear axle with primitive tires. The Challenger looked tough, sounded mean, and went like hell in a straight line, but it demanded respect, skill, and constant attention. Make a mistake and it would bite hard. Only a few hundred Hemi Challengers were built in 1970, making them rare and valuable. But back then, they were just the biggest, baddest muscle cars on American roads. Machines that prove sometimes the most legendary cars are the ones most likely to kill you. These 12 machines represented the absolute peak of American muscle car excess across 3 decades of horsepower wars. They were built in eras when power mattered more than safety, when cubic inches were king, and when survival depended entirely on driver skill and respect for what you were piloting. The insurance companies eventually caught up. The government stepped in with regulations, and common sense suggested that maybe, just maybe, giving the general public access to 500 horsepower rear-drive cars with drum brakes and bias-ply tires wasn't the smartest idea. But for those glorious years, when these machines ruled the streets, they represented the American automotive industry at its most ambitious, most audacious, and most dangerous. These weren't just fast cars. They were weapons that demanded respect, challenges that separated the skilled from the survivors, and legends that proved sometimes the most memorable machines are the ones that scared you the most. Which of these dangerous legends would you be brave enough to drive at the limit? Drop your answer in the comments below. And if you love stories from the eras when muscle cars were raw, unforgiving, and absolutely magnificent, hit that subscribe button for more tales of American iron that refuse to be tamed.